Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss how we're transforming the oil and gas sector with data. The oil and gas sector is a major contributor to climate change, and the industry has been under increased pressure to adapt in light of global climate commitments. The emissions from oil and gas companies have been under fire from courts and shareholders alike. Just on Monday, we saw more than 30 countries sign on to a global methane pledge ahead of COP26. Can we advance to the next slide? And yet, in spite of acknowledging the sector's outsized climate impact, we have lacked an accurate picture of where exactly emissions are coming from, which has made acting on them much more difficult. But all of that is changing. Can we go ahead 2 slides? Today, I am very pleased to welcome 3 exceptional speakers. Lekha Sridhar is a policy analyst with WattTime, Fran Royland, a senior associate with RMI, and Debbie Gordon, a senior principal here at RMI. Next slide, please. As for our agenda, we'll start with a brief demonstration of Climate Trace, showing how the state-of-the-art platform is providing unprecedented transparency to all man-made greenhouse gases globally, and specifically what we learned about oil and gas emissions. Then we'll learn how going even deeper into oil and gas assets themselves reveals even greater opportunities to address and mitigate emissions. Finally, we'll see emissions transparency is an important lever in RMI's overall strategy to help markets make climate-intelligent decisions. After that, we'll move into audience Q&A. You can pose your questions anytime by entering them into the chat function on Zoom. Lekha, over to you.
Thanks, CJ. Hi, everyone. My name is Lekha Sridhar, and I'm a policy analyst with WattTime. We're a clean tech nonprofit and co-founding member of Climate Trace with RMI. Next slide, please. 2021 has proven to be an incredibly crucial year for climate action. Although not all countries have ramped up their NDCs, several countries, regions, cities, and even multinational companies have committed to net zero targets. But all of these commitments require much better data than the current state of the art. Next slide. Over 100 countries don't have official emissions data after 2015. That's because it's expensive and resource intensive to measure emissions. And that's true even for the global north countries, where it can take a year or longer to collect data and model emissions for submission to the UNFCCC. And that's just national level emissions. At the subnational, city, or asset level, data is sparsely available in only a few geographies and at specific points in time. And this is a challenge because transparency and verification are central to the Paris Agreement. But also transparency is just a starting point. Reliable, up-to-date, and granular data can unlock many new opportunities to reduce emissions and achieve all of these ambitious net zero goals. Next slide. For instance, at WattTime, we're focused on the use of marginal grid emissions data to identify locations for siting renewable energy plants that can displace dirtier fossil fuels. But we can't do that in most parts of the world because they lack granular data to provide that kind of analysis. You'll also be hearing from Fran about how asset level emissions can enable mitigation in the oil and gas sector. Next slide. That's why in 2019, we partnered with Transition Zero and were funded by google.org to use satellite imagery to track power plant emissions. To track power plant emissions using satellite imagery and artificial intelligence. Basically, we use imagery to spot plumes from power plants and detect whether they're on or off and use that to estimate emissions. When we announced this project, the overwhelming response was that while this project was useful, it would be much more impactful to monitor emissions from all sectors. Next slide, please. And that's how our coalition came together. We're a group of nonprofits, universities, and tech companies who have expertise in individual sector, but are collaborating to share resources and best practices to use the best available methods for each of our sectors, but make them available on a unified platform for users. Next slide. Our recently launched inventory reflects emissions data through the end of 2020 across most major emissions of the global economy. And it fills an important gap in existing emissions inventories because it is up-to-date, independent, and uses direct observations to inform our estimates. And this is just the beginning. We've built an approach that allows us to get more and more detailed over time. Next slide. on our planned roadmap, we have two goals. The first is to increase our coverage to all emission sectors, including some of those harder to measure sectors like landfills and animal feedlots, where we're partnering with the Mineral Foundation and Synthetic respectively to use satellite imagery and machine learning to identify the locations of these kind of emitting activities. We've already got prototypes for these sectors and are now working to expand them globally. Next slide, please. Our other goal is to get more granular, both spatially and temporally. You can take a look at Trace Places, a preview of our asset level emissions platform. A few examples of assets from different sectors are already available there. And over the coming year, we will be expanding the capability of Trace Places. Next slide, please. And we're excited to partner with organizations to take forward these goals, particularly if you can help us improve our coverage, provide us with access to new high-resolution data that's needed for training machine learning models, provide your expertise to help us improve our current estimates, or even help us understand, as a potential user, what sort of data features would be valuable to you and enable you to reduce emissions. That's the kind of information that helps us prioritize future goals on our roadmap. With that, I'll hand it off to Fran to tell you more about the oil and gas sector.
Thank you, Leica, for that great background on Trace. And hello, everyone. My name is Fran Royland. I'm a senior associate with RMI and really excited to share about our RMI's contributions to the Trace Coalition. I'm a part of the Climate Intelligence Program here, and we are a co-founding member of Trace, and we were responsible for the oil and gas sector data and analysis. Reducing emissions from fossil fuel production is a major focus of our team's work, because we believe that while the future must be powered by 100% clean energy, our mission until we get to that point is to reduce the climate impact of producing oil and gas. And we know that significant warming can be avoided if we address methane and other important greenhouse gas emissions now. When you navigate to the global emissions profile on the Trace platform, which we saw in that pie chart a few slides back, we see that oil and gas is responsible for about 1 in every 10 emissions from all anthropogenic sectors. And as a reminder, this is just the industry responsible portion of emissions. So this includes emissions from production, processing, transporting, and refining oil and gas, but does not include the emissions associated with the end use of this array of products. The Trace site allows you to explore these sectors individually. So we can see that oil and gas production and refining combined account for about 23.26 billion tons of CO2e throughout the course of a 6-year time series, 2015 to 2020. Can you click ahead, please? Thanks. Right, so this total represents the 6 years time series analysis. And I also want to call out on this slide that a full methodology for arriving at these results is also available and linked on this Trace site. If you can click ahead, please. Great, and next slide. As one dives deeper into these oil and gas results, we're also able to explore subsectors and country rankings. And this was one of our key findings highlighted during the Trace launch, was that these country rankings really shift significantly depending on which subsector breakdown you're looking at. On the left side, we have oil production, top emitting country rankings, and on the right, we have the refining rankings. And we can see that it's really a small handful of country players here that are accounting for the bulk of emissions. Several countries like the US and Russia appear on both lists. So they're emitting doubly in high amounts, both for producing and refining. Meanwhile, there are other country actors that are top emitters in one, but not the other. As we well know, we're not able to manage emissions that we can't measure. So we believe that the analysis and insights derived from Trace are important because they can help country policymakers identify the right actions to pursue today. Global decarbonization will start with each nation knowing where its emissions are coming from, and in this way being able to tailor its reduction strategies and where it emits the most. Next slide, please. So Leica spoke earlier about the difficulties in existing emissions inventories. And this relates to another key takeaway from our Trace work, was that the self-reporting today, specifically in the oil and gas sector, is wholly inadequate for a number of reasons. Many top emitters don't even report their sector-specific emissions. So in this chart on the right, we have the dark blue squares that are marked next to the top 15 oil and gas producers. and the light blue squares next to the refiners. And as we can see indicated with the gray missing label boxes on the right, at least or about 1/2 of these top emitters aren't required to regularly report these emissions. We conservatively estimate that over 1 billion additional tons of CO2 equivalent have gone uncounted by nations that aren't required to regularly report their oil and gas sectors emissions. Another layer of this analysis was looking at the alignment between the trace results and current inventories where they do exist. And this alignment, as indicated by the red fuchsia color and the green, ranges really from poor to strong. And in the end, what this tells us is that improving completeness, improving accuracy and confidence in the current inventories is going to be required to have a good grasp on emissions accounting, but it's also going to be required for verifiable tracking of reduction strategies. Next slide, please. On the whole, the Trace first version product and platform is great for looking at macro level trends. It brings light to country and global level emissions and really allows us to take this wider view. So we can look at whether or not any individual sector emissions are increasing or decreasing, but we also want to make sure we're not playing a game of emissions whack-a-mole where gains in one sector might be being negated by losses in another. So we can really just take this comprehensive zoomed out version of are we on track? That all said, our climate intelligence team really believes that there's even more power at the level of asset scale data. Quantifying and differentiating country level emissions is certainly critical, but we're working to expand this transparency beyond the national level data in order to reveal more opportunities to slash GHG emissions. So through our work, we're also drilling down to this level of oil and gas assets and operations. Ultimately, our country level analyses are backed up by basin and field level estimates that show a wide range in emissions activity. And this screenshot tableau in front of you allows us to dig deeper into these field level estimates. The red bar on the right shows how we're doing on a global and country level scale. This is a similar level insight that's currently available on the Trace website. But if I can draw your attention to the blue squares on the left, we're seeing a breakdown of field level emissions, really showing an order of magnitude that sets apart some of the biggest emitters and the smallest emitting fields. And this is the type of asset level data that can provide intelligence needed to differentiate emissions in an actionable way. We see an opportunity to enhance competitiveness in the oil and gas sector because when it comes to climate change, no 2 barrels of oil or cubic feet of gas are the same in terms of their climate footprints, even though they are traded in the global economy as if they are. And recognizing these important emissions differences could cut emissions that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. The final portion of this chart to draw your attention to is back on the bar chart on the right, this time looking at the orange and blue bars instead of the red. And what this is doing is breaking out the greenhouse gas emissions for both carbon dioxide, largely driven by combustion sources, apart from methane. We think this can tell an even more robust story for oil and gas resources and for countries. Next slide, thanks. So as an example of this, we've zoomed in on the United States on the left and Indonesia on the right and provided are looking at these country profiles. And if you look at that bar chart again on the right, for Indonesia, we see that the orange bar or CO2 combustion sources are really driving Indonesia's emissions profile. Meanwhile, on the left, we're seeing the blue bar or the methane sources have much more parity with the CO2 combustion sources. And it's really figuring out which gases and what are the sources of these gases are driving a country's emissions is essential in order to be able to tailor mitigation approach. Next slide. The final tool that I'll preview today is something called the Oil Climate Index Plus Gas, or OCI Plus. This is a tool that has undergone multiple iterations throughout its lifetime and is currently undergoing a rebuild here at RMI. Right now, this image is just showing a sample of the beta tool. Once it's fully reconstructed and built out, the OCI will be an interactive web tool that compares full life cycle emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from individual oil and gas assets around the world. This tool is really designed with multiple end users in mind for the public to be able to understand this differentiation between different oil and gas assets, for policymakers and industry to take a look at the full scope of their emissions, and also to be able to understand what kind of levers may be able to be applied to reduce emissions in their specific locales. The OCI takes a life cycle look at emissions. So this starts at the point of extraction of the resource and goes all the way through end uses, be it for combustion in power or transformation to a petrochemical, et cetera. The OCI tool also looks at specific scenario reduction measures that can be applied to different oil and gas resources. So looking, for example, in that in the image on the right-hand side, there are different toggles that give the user the ability to test, let's say, reduced or increased flaring, or the ability to incorporate renewable solar steam for enhanced oil recovery, and see how this sort of jockeys and changes the rankings of the climate intensities of different oils and gases. Right now, this tool just contains a sample of our oil and gas fields. We're currently working to build it out to the hundreds of fields that underpin our trace country level results. So please stay tuned for a full launch of the tool this coming winter. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our senior principal, Debbie Gordon, to bring it home and connect this back to major efforts going on at RMI.
Great. Thanks so much, Fran. Hello, everyone. I'm Debbie Gordon. I'm a senior principal at RMI, and I'm here to tell you about how we're going to use these data to reduce oil and gas sector emissions now, as we simultaneously chart a broader, longer-term energy transition. So looking at this first slide, which is basically RMI's theory of change, starting with the first chevron, and that's what we've been talking about, making emissions visible is the essential first step, because basically, and I've heard Al Gore say this several times through the project, we cannot measure what we do not know. But transparency itself is not the end game. With these data, we're working to generate climate intelligence. Beyond sheer visibility, we analyze emissions, as Fran was explaining, using the OCI plus model to assess the emissions of operating facilities and future production. And we can also project future emissions of facilities that aren't built yet. We then use satellites and other monitoring equipment to attribute emissions to their sources. And we are tracking and ultimately plan to digitize emissions through the life cycle to set standards and create climate differentiated markets. For example, pricing oil and gas based on their own emission signatures, as Fran was mentioning, rather than turning a blind eye to oil and gas climate impacts and pricing all oil and gas the same, regardless of their greenhouse gas emissions, which is the case today. And as we're working to transition off oil and gas, this bounty of information that we are gathering in open source platforms will inform policy and market decision-making about cutting emissions now and weaning ourselves off of the most climate intensive assets worldwide that do the most damage. So next slide. Fran discussed the OCI plus model, which we use to calculate oil and gas life cycle emissions, as she said, from production, processing, refining, shipping, and end-use consumption. And together with our partners at Stanford and the University of Calgary, RMI is currently analyzing climate intensity of about 75% of the world's oil and gas. And that's what Fran mentioned will come out in January. The other valuable tool that we're using to attribute emissions is satellites. Through our public-private nonprofit partnership, Carbon Mapper, which is shown on this slide, we're currently detecting and quantifying methane emissions from aircraft flyover emissions that will soon be supplemented by newly launching satellites. As the sample maps from Louisiana show, Carbon Mapper is attributing and quantifying very large methane emission sources from oil and gas and other sources as well. We found landfills and dairies and other sources. This offers a real opportunity for rapid response, avoiding emissions, and significantly reducing and bringing significant emission reductions. Next slide. We're also using emissions transparency to advance standards and activate markets. I mean, really, oil and gas is just money in another form. We use it all the time. It moves through the economy very quickly, and it's very, very hard to turn off, as we've seen historically. MIQ, as shown here, is an independent certification standard for oil and gas methane emissions that offers transparent accountability and enables markets to accelerate emissions reductions. Next slide. Together, RMI and Systemic have started this NGO MIQ, and specifically MIQ differentiates oil and gas life cycle emissions and gives each facility an A through an F grade based on its methane intensity, the operating practices used, and ongoing emissions monitoring. And we can replicate MIQ type standards, these certification standards, in landfills, in petrochemical facilities, and other operations with varying emission intensities. In other words, anytime there's a variable in terms of differentiating emissions, the market needs to have that information, because without it, it can't function properly to reduce emissions. Next slide. We're in the process of certifying methane emissions from 1 in every 10 cubic feet of gas produced in the United States. Oil and gas companies operating globally are now getting engaged as well. And this will help align markets to support the global methane pledge that was announced earlier this week that aims to cut methane emissions 30% by 2030. And next slide. RMI believes that there are actionable, cost-effective solutions to make the oil and gas we use today as low emitting as possible that will significantly cut emissions as we also transition to a zero carbon energy systems. Avoiding what we can do today, despite these goals of getting off oil and gas, leaves emissions on the table and in the atmosphere. This underscores the climate urgency of knowing our oil and gas, and our team will continue to work to expand this amazing new trove of transparent data, deep analytics, standards development, enterprise insights, and market mechanisms to rapidly cut oil and gas sector emissions. Back to you, TJ, for Q&A.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Leica and Fran as well. Those are some wonderful presentations, and I think provided a lot of insight into the work that we've all done. We'll now turn to address some of the questions I've seen coming up in chat. There are quite a few really good ones. Again, please use the Q&A function if you have any further questions. But to kick things off, what can be done to reduce the use of gas as a substitute for coal and reduce oil as a substitute for gas? And then after that, how do we reduce the use of gas and production of gas? Debbie, is this one for you?
Am I on? Yes, I'm there. Yes, I mean, it's interesting that I'll pick on oil first. Oil's often brought up as an easily substituted resource. And the reality is our oil is not used in ways that our coal is used. Gas and coal are substitutable alongside with renewables. And there's a lot of market competition in the gas market for whatever the most available, cleanest, and cheapest resource is. So this tension between coal and gas and renewables is real and is really important for the environment to internalize those externalities and bring it into the market. Oil, to my mind, has an entirely different proposition. It's not an easily if you think about everything that comes out of a barrel of oil, from solvents and lubricants and sulfur for medicine, all the way to jet fuel and gasoline and fuel oil and backup generator diesel, for not losing power in your home. It's very hard to imagine every part of that barrel being substituted by anything other than oil, which is why it's been so hard to get off oil. And that's why we're working so hard to differentiate at first the emissions in each of these otherwise equivalent barrels of oil, because at least it gives us some first action in the marketplace. I don't know if others want to add.
All right, seeing nothing else on this question, we'll move to the next one. What do you see as the main reasons that the US does not have adequate emission data?
I can start with part of this one, maybe tag team with Debbie. So the approach that we use to estimate and measure emissions for US assets is the use of the OPG model. And there's been some extensive research done on specific sources that have been undercounted in the US inventories. Storage tanks tend to be a big culprit. The emissions factors that are often used to calculate emissions from this specific source just don't capture the high magnitudes of emissions that can leak, specifically around methane. So this is one, there's really specific sources in the inventories that have just been inadequate for too long. And I think as more technologies become online and available, we're starting to understand that true emissions distribution better. And there's work being done right now to improve those inventories.
I can add, And I think that there are a lot of layers of issues with starting with self-reporting, which is in and of itself variable based on the operator doing the self-reporting. The timeliness of emissions in terms of what it takes to submit a report and what the satellites are going to do to change that with real-time information, as Leica was showing, is going to wrestle the system and change it up, which I think will be really helpful. The use of basic emission factors is a really big problem. Very few systems operate exactly as they are designed to operate. And so I even, as an example, had an interesting conversation out of the Obama administration with the US Treasury that was designing a carbon tax at the time. And when the Treasury paid me a visit, we went through how they did the calculations for actually implementing the carbon tax. And it turns out that they were using one number of 432 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel for every oil in every use. And that didn't matter if it's a steamed oil in California that has a lot more emissions, or, Norway Ekofisk that tends to be, or Gawar in Saudi Arabia that come out of the ground without much use, without much work at all. And there's often not an appreciation of how varying these emissions are, and that just it supports the use of very simple emission factors to put these emissions out. And then I guess the last thing would be the way our system is set up in the U.S. The greenhouse gas reporting program is only for major emitters. So with fracking taking off in the US, we have a lot of small that add up to a big number, but we have a lot of small operators that fall below the bar in terms of self-reporting. But all of these emissions from EPA are really kind of at the top of major producers. So we're missing a lot of emissions just for the sheer fact of having a cutoff.
Thank you. Quicker question then, will the OCI remain basin-based or will it be company or site-based in the future?
Debbie, I don't know, you're one of the original masterminds of the OCI. I suspect it will remain basin and resource-based for a while, but I do want to point out an interesting analysis. What we're looking at right now is what happens when different fields or different assets change hands from one company to another, because that can really shift emissions depending on the climate stewardship, operational stewardship with that and practices that are undertaken by different companies. That said, I think some of the emissions differences is really just inherent to the different nature of different resources. So I think it's important to look at it both ways.
And the MIQ standard gets at it both ways, which I really like. The standard that I was showing on methane from oil and gas, it's actually not only has an emissions intensity that would differ from field to field based on the actual reservoir often, and the characteristics of the built system around that reservoir and the characteristics there that really reside with the field itself. So what am I getting out of the ground and what do I have to do to get it out of the ground? And that doesn't often depend on the operator. That depends on where you're actually drilling a hole and taking things out. But the second part of MIQ, which I really like, it has a company practices component to grading that gas, because not every company applies their knowledge and applies their know-how in exactly the same way. And there are more and less responsible operators. So I think that we will stick with field level because that's the emissions are associated with removing that asset from the ground, but there will always be some element of, like Fran said, tracking the responsible nature of the operator in that facility.
Thanks, Debbie. And Leica, this one is for you. How can data companies partner with RMI and Climate Trace?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So one of the sort of foundations of Climate Trace is that for so many of these questions that we're asking, when and where are these emissions coming from, there is already significant amount of data that's already been generated in globally. May not be specifically for the purpose of emissions tracking, but it exists, and combining all of these data and using approaches like machine learning can help actually convert those to emissions estimates. We've been speaking to industry partners like shipping companies and power plant operators to get data at the plant or asset level and use that as training data to improve our models. And that's one significant way that we're looking for people to partner with us. But in addition, we also want to hear from people to know, if you had access to better data, how would that help you reduce emissions, and what does better data mean to you? So that's the kind of information that also helps us prioritize our roadmap down the road. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Now we have Alberta oil from tar sands gets shipped many miles via pipeline after some upgrading to refineries in the southern US and then goes on to further downstream areas. The greenhouse gases associated with this transportation are likely small, but is there an attempt to consider that in the OCI? Debbie, this one's for you.
It's in there. And unfortunately with the oil sands, one of the big question marks has been what's in the pipeline. And this is an economic question more than it really is. It's changing based on economics. So Canada, when they first started developing their oil sands in large measure over a decade ago, were all about upgrading that oil sand up in Canada and putting synthetic crude, which was like perfectly tailored for refining, into the pipeline. So the pipelines were built to carry the synthetic crude oil that was all cleaned up and a perfect input to a refinery. But then the economics changed a bit, and we started fracking. That was a big change. And the fracking was happening in North Dakota, which is close to Canada. And so Canada changed course, and they have been not upgrading, they have been diluting their bitumen. So they ship very light oil and condensate from North Dakota. They dilute their bitumen, which is interesting because it's almost like mixing like peanut butter and it's like thinning out tahini almost. You take something really thick and solid and then you water it down, but you're not changing what's in the pipeline. You're just mixing these two things together to ship it through the pipeline. But all of that shipping, to answer the question, whether it's by upgrading, which means that you're putting a synthetic oil in, or if you're doing a diluted bitumen, which is a whole different substance in, those estimates for shipping, while small, per barrel, they're not small emissions, but per barrel, they don't add a lot to the carbon intensity of that oil. Those are included, and you can break them out in the OCI. And you could change distances, and you can make different assumptions.
Thank you. And if we can generalize, how are producers reacting to the emissions data that these tools are generating?
What are you going to say, Fred?
I was going to say that there's a range. I think some are eager to collaborate and help improve the work. Several members of industry, I think, sit on data that could improve these models. There's a lot of big gaps, data gaps in knowing about the composition of gas, that they are really some of the first to know and are in a position to share if they'd like to help improve the work. That said, I think that there are others who are not quite at that stage.
And I was just going to add, what's really heartening actually is there are data providers, and these would be the likes of like Wood Mackenzie or Global Data or Rystad. They're getting more, and those provide a lot of the input data that we need, like production volumes and gas to oil ratios and the basic inputs of the oil climate index. Not secretive, sensitive data, but they're necessary. Those data providers have been coming to the table to partner more with us and are very interested, and some are already using these tools that they are privately working with companies to share information on. And so that just shows a socialization of this whole process of internal emissions accounting and understanding in companies. And I know, having myself come early in my career from Chevron, the number of people within a corporation that are actually given the responsibility to do climate work is so small. I mean, they just can't be everywhere and do everything. So the more intelligence they have, the smarter these companies will be. And many of them have figured that out.
And then, Leica, to bring it up a level, have you seen strong reactions to any of the other kind of climate trace data sets we've released?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that so far the reactions have actually been positive. In the run-up to our public launch, we did speak to a few companies and just different sorts of stakeholders, and many definitely were curious and wanted to compare their data with ours as a sort of two-way kind of validation process, but also many were very interested in contributing. Many companies are kind of at the forefront of environmental technologies and decarbonizing their sectors, and they'd really like to be able to kind of push their entire sector forward, and we're definitely seeing that from many stakeholders.
Can I just add on to what Leica said? Because Leica, you just reminded me. So the majority of the world's oil and gas is produced and refined by countries, by national oil companies. So starting at the country level is really interesting. Although we started at the asset level and added it back up to the country level, but I know that Saudi Arabia reached out to Trace, and then I was on a workshop in Saudi Arabia as they are trying to improve their inventory, which dates back right now to 2012. That's their most recent greenhouse gas inventory. So they want help improving it and updating it. So this data isn't just about companies, it's also about, it really is very much about countries where a lot of these sectors are operated from.
Excellent. So then kind of riffing off of that country level, have you discussed subsetting the traded commodities via the trading exchanges by their classification instead?
I think someone's reading our mind. Fran and I were just talking about this. So we're really interested to tee up that conversation by talking about the baskets of oil. So when you talk about traded baskets of crude, like the Brent basket, so famous, or the OPEC basket, these baskets trade at one price. Of course, it shifts spot markets and it moves around, but they're basically a single price for this composite barrel. But the emissions in that composite barrel can differ by a factor of 25 or more, 25x or more in terms of their climate intensity. And that difference in pricing of those barrels in the composite barrel, the traded barrel, are not appreciated. So we were thinking of teeing up that conversation, exactly what the question asked, from that point of view, because it's so recognizable that these are traded commodities that have a singular price attached to them with no reality check on climate whatsoever.
Excellent. And then kind of shifting a little bit beyond oil and gas, what do you think are solutions for industries such as steel, cement, metalworks, and glass?
I'm happy to answer that. Our climate change partner for the heavy industry sector is Transition Zero, and I encourage everyone to go and check out the amazing research that they're doing. So I don't want to speak for them, but one of the kind of findings from the data that that they submitted as part of climate change was that countries that have electrified their heavy industry sectors are seeing fewer emissions, which seems like a really obvious answer, but it's clearly the low-hanging fruit that that a lot of countries can adopt. But for other solutions, definitely check out Transition Zero's website.
And I could just add, TJ, that one of the other projects on our team that we're not directly working on, but in climate intelligence, is to, and you mentioned digitization that came up in my slides. We are actually working to trace emissions and track emissions for steel, starting with steel, and to digitize those emissions so that those that purchase steel will know that life cycle of emissions that went into producing that unit of steel, in order, again, to differentiate and bring a market component, because there's a demand for lower emitting steel, for lower emitting jet fuel, for lower emitting cement. These desires are out there for lower emitting natural gas. That's the MIQ standard. So steel will be first off in that digitization platform.
And the final one I'll throw out is the Emission Possible partnership as well. So this is more of an industry collaboration being led by ETC, RMI, and some other partners. And they're doing a lot of more kind of the innovation technology side of the work to help develop these solutions. Next question I see is, what are the main barriers right now to account for the low emissions data available in the US?
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know why something of this wouldn't pass easily, but when we first released the Oil Climate Index back in 2015, Senator Huffman from California, US Senator Huffman, picked up on it and wrote a bill called the Know Your Oil Act. And that act, which sat through a couple of Congresses, and I don't know if it's going to be reintroduced, was only about one thing: data transparency. Just provide this basic information. The Energy Information Administration, the part of Department of Energy that does a lot of reporting, we've met with them. They aren't allowed as an official statistical agency to reach into industry and get information. They are the recipients of information that industry wants to provide. So there's a bit of a roadblock here in terms of something that no one really could argue against. Transparency is good, especially when it's nothing secret. It's just a matter of doing it. And I think that I'm watching different arms of government talk about doing it, but I think it's maybe the TRACE project can help, bring that hurdle up and over to show how woefully lacking the system is right now, how much help we need with more transparency, and some of this information could be facilitated by just making it public.
Thank you, Debbie. How can global buyers be encouraged to reduce their purchase of high CO2 and methane sources? Is global pricing necessary?
I was waiting for someone else to speak. Okay.
Debbie, sorry. TJ, could you repeat the first part of that one?
Sure. How can global buyers be encouraged to reduce their purchase of high carbon dioxide and methane sources?
I was going to, just in answering that, almost flip it on its head a little bit. And it makes me think of some of the incentives around participating in something like MIQ, rather than being disincentivized to purchase, high emitting, there's incentive to purchase the certified low emitting resources, and that, with a credible standard like MIQ that has, a multi-pronged framework for understanding that the intensity of certain certified facilities is low, that these companies at specific facilities are implementing best practices, using regular monitoring technologies, to have high confidence that emissions associated with specific facility batches are lower than the rest of the crowd. I think that is the way that we see a voluntary standard at the moment, like MIQ, heading in that direction.
Great, thank you, Fran. Jumping into the next one, will you utilize existing and/or develop new life cycle inventory information? How will facility-specific direct and scope 3 emissions be compiled, such as using conventional LCA software? And is there a way facilities can participate in the data provision in a confidential manner while still building aggregated data for public transparency?
Maybe I can provide a sort of general climate trace response for that. Our method of estimating emissions isn't by using scope 1, 2, or 3, but at the source where emissions occur. And that information can potentially be used by companies and organizations for reporting their scope 1 to 3 emissions. But absolutely, yes, we welcome data providers, including anonymized data. High resolution data is incredibly valuable to train, as I mentioned before, to train our machine learning models. So really welcome that.
Thanks, Leica. Any other takes on that one? So then talking a little bit more about the emissions factors, to Debbie's earlier point about using standard emissions factors, aren't all of these factors worldwide based on EPA one-off calculations, such as for the Gulf Coast using a certain temperature and pressure? What makes you think that these factors are not gamed like we have seen in reported vehicle diesel emissions?
No, it's a great point. I mean, the reality is that very, very little equipment, and absolutely, I can say no resource base like an oil or a gas field or a refinery have a single or a sum of single emission factors just for each piece of equipment. We're seeing this really interestingly with the satellite work. What the satellites are starting to see is three variants of emissions. And I don't know the answer to how EPA is going to have to, and other agencies will have to update their thinking, because I think it really is very, it's very simplistic as the question, as the questioner, stated it. But what the satellites are starting to see, and the sensors that are flying over, the satellite sensors are seeing, they're seeing fugitive emissions that are part of routine operations that are relatively small, but from a handful of pieces of equipment, and we're getting better distributions and answers about that, how much vapor leaks from a tank, how much methane leaks from a compressor, things like that. They're seeing persistent sources that are large, often because equipment isn't operating as designed. But it's kind of a planned episode. It's not an upset. It's just that this is how the equipment is operating, and it's a large emission source that's persisting, and those aren't factored into these emission factors right now. It's only perfect operations under the best circumstances. And then the third, that's the most confounding here, are the large intermittent sources. So these are sources of emissions that don't necessarily persist. They might happen when there's a transfer of a product. It might happen when there's a turnover in a flow of a chemical plant. There are burps of emissions in the system that are in no way captured by emission factors. They're not even business. They're kind of like either maintenance or abnormal operating practices or one-off, operations that don't happen consistently. But they're the known unknowns in the system. And I do think the satellites will help bring attention back to this and are going to change the way that we do accounting in this space. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
And I want to follow up on the satellites. I've seen a couple of questions around that area. So kind of in addition to Carbon Mapper, how is TRACE going to collaborate with groups such as EDF's Methane Sat or GHG Sat that are active?
I can start on that one. I've also seen a question in the chat on how our data sets compare with existing estimates that are already out there, such as the IEA's methane tracker, which I actually worked on last year. And this has been a very exciting, I would say, triangulation and reconciliation exercise, because there are these independent methods, well, somewhat independent methods of arriving at different methods, specifically when we're talking about the methane emissions portion of oil and gas sector estimates. So we're looking at a country by country level to see how are our totals stacking up to, let's say, a satellite generated inversion compared to the IEA's country estimate and compared to that country's inventories. And in some places, it's indicating really strong alignment across the board, which would suggest we might have a higher confidence in the true value of methane from that place. On the other hand, there can be wide variation in these different estimates in other countries. And I think that's where it indicates to us that we need to take a deeper dive at the data, looking at the inputs, maybe using taskable satellite instruments that are out there, and as an opportunity to get better intelligence in those places where it would suggest that the knowledge is there's a lot of room for improvement in the true emissions value from that place.
Thanks, Fran. Any other responses? All right. Do you foresee a private monitoring and verification market based on the proposed emissions penalties in the Build Back Better plan? If so, would TRACE accept inputs from private monitoring and verification companies?
Maybe I can get started on that, and then Debbie or Fran can jump in. I think there's still so much information that we don't know, so it's kind of hard to know about like private monitoring and verification markets. But there are some promising signs of data being harmonized. For example, the SEC has started an inquiry into self-reported scope 1 to 3 emissions that companies are reporting, and kind of harmonizing these sort of voluntary individual efforts. So if that continues, then that's definitely a promising sign. But as for whether Climate Trace welcomes input from private MRV companies, absolutely we do. However, our kind of central aim is, of course, to make our data public. So that's something for our potential partners to think about as well, if that's a concern.
And I could build off of that. I mean, certainly everything that we're doing is open source, trying to build up transparency in this whole sector, but that doesn't mean that we also don't work with and use anonymized data and work with any number of operators to give us more robust input data, because, you know, we really do want the best what's actually happening at ground zero to inform how we react to it. And I think that the questioner, just so others that are listening know, there's a really interesting provision in the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill on a methane fee. It's the first time ever, because we don't have carbon fees either. So it's really the short-lived climate pollutant of the most concern in the moment. And there's a portion of the bill that would charge $1,800 a metric ton of methane for any emissions associated with methane. If that passes, and I really hope it does, because I think it will bring a whole new light to managing methane and avoiding those emissions and rapidly repairing them when they do happen, which is what's harming the climate, that they just linger. That the big question is, how will that information and then ultimately that charge be conveyed? And I don't know, often it's a very short bill if you look it up. So these are the kinds of details that often get worked out in implementation. And whether private companies can report in to then trigger a charge is what, you know, we don't necessarily know yet. But again, there are so many satellites that are going up now that are quite complementary: public, private, nonprofit satellites, all sorts of government and private satellites, EDF's Methane Sat, the Carbon Mapper Coalition, that there's going to be a lot of checks and balances on the system to verify that fee.
Thank you. And what would you say are the most important steps that oil and gas majors must take to appropriately tackle their methane emissions?
I mean, I guess I would say if any company or even new country wanting to produce gas, or existing country wants to be in this game longest and really make their investments pay out over the long term, these systems have to be leak free. The tolerance levels for leakage that we've watched over the last, generation are no longer going to be tolerated. So it really is it's a big heavy lift, but it's going to be really understanding each of those sources of equipment. And it's not every piece of equipment. Certain pieces of equipment are much more prone to leakage. And it's really understanding and sourcing and designing and operating equipment in a much more watchful way. And so I would say it's a big charge, but I would say leak-free system is number one.
I would add, and I think it's a good just opportunity to bring up that compared to other, high investment changes that the industry may be looking to make, we often hear that, methane reduction opportunities are some of the most cost-effective relative to other choices. A lot of the technologies are known to exist and can be readily applied to known emission sources. And at the same time, I think that in some cases there's economic gain to be made from preventing this leakage. So across the, generally speaking, methane reduction opportunities are often some of the most appealing from an industry perspective too.
Thank you. And then will the OCI attribute extraction and refining to the same market source?
The way I'll just explain how we've done the OCI, because we don't have transparency on the actual yet, maybe someday, but on the actual movements of the molecules through the whole supply chain. The way we've done it is we have started with the basis is that barrel out of the ground of oil or that cubic foot of gas, and tracks that through its extraction and what it takes to take it out of the ground and the emissions that result from that, and then take that same barrel through its refining and processing and transport and into the end uses that fan out of the refinery in that barrel. So what we don't have open source readily are the actual flows of different oils and gases beyond that resource to different places around the world. Luckily, the refining of oils tend not to matter. Like basically, if you refine a certain barrel of oil in this refinery in America or that refinery in China, those emissions should not be vastly different, although there will be some differences based on equipment, as we were saying before, with how equipment is spec'd and ordered. But the hope will be that someday we'll be able to actually, my dream would be to have at the gas pump, you would, like we're doing with these digitization and steel, you would actually know that that gallon of gasoline came from this field, was processed in this country, and then made its way to my gas station. And then I would have four corners, and I could go to the gas station that had the gasoline that was the lowest emitting. Like that would be my dream of doing all this. I will say, if people, I can try to find the link or follow up if anyone writes to me. We published 2 papers in the last couple of years, one in Nature Climate Change and one in Science, the Science on the production and the Nature Climate Change on the refining side. And those actually did track on the refining side emissions to barrels with private data that we were able to get, the emissions that are actually in country with the collection of oils that they end up taking. And the differences aren't that great when you just assume an optimal refinery, or you take it to the country's refinery.
Thank you, Debbie. And we have time for just a few more questions at this point. We're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. So can you comment on how global natural gas price volatility might affect the ability of MIQ to influence the demand side of natural gas markets? For example, if there are high natural gas prices, will that steer buyers to a product with lower MIQ rating because of cost considerations?
So I guess someday, if all gas trades this way, it will be in a spot market because that will be all gas. But right now, and I could definitely refer whoever has, if you want deeper information on this, I'll definitely connect you to the person on our team who's working on MIQ. But right now, it's very contract based. So we're connecting buyers and sellers. And those are buyers that want to, for reputational reasons, for their national regulatory reasons, for coming, policy reasons, they are entering into contracts that aren't spot market based. So they would arrive at a price that they would have for a certain amount of time. And so that volatility doesn't really affect the price of that MIQ gas. It's like it's a longer term contract, rather than being in the spot market. Someday, if we're so lucky, and MIQ, like I said, is all gas traded, it will have to operate around those, the movement that we're seeing. And especially now, there's a lot of movement, but it comes and goes in terms of price volatility in the oil and gas, and in all commodity markets for that matter.
Thank you. And I think we are out of time for questions. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Apologies if there's anything we didn't get to. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insightful questions. We look forward to engaging with you as much as we can. A recording will be sent in a follow-up email to all attendees within 48 hours of the webinar. We can also include some links to our work, to MIQ, and other things I saw there were questions about. If you'd like to learn more about RMI's work, you can see our websites listed here. You can also follow us at our social media accounts or contact us directly. Again, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. Take care.